Canadian Forces Base North Bay, also CFB North Bay, is an Air Force base located at the city of North Bay, Ontario, about 350 kilometers north of Toronto. The base is subordinate to 1 Canadian Air Division, Winnipeg, Manitoba, and is the center for North American Aerospace Defense Command operations in Canada, under the Canadian NORAD Region Headquarters, also in Winnipeg. It is also home to the 1 Air Force Detachment 2 of the United States Air Force. 22 Wing Canadian Forces Base North Bay is the most important military base in Canada with respect to the continental air defense of North America, and the country's air sovereignty. It is also home to one of the most unusual military installations in North America, the NORAD Underground Complex, a bunker the size of a shopping center, 60 stories beneath the surface of the Earth. On the 1st of April 1993, all air bases in Canada were redesignated as wings. The base was renamed 22 Wing Canadian Forces Base North Bay. This is abbreviated as 22 Wing CFB North Bay. Today, although this designation still stands, the base is often referred to simply as 22 Wing, and the base commander as the Wing Commander. North Bay's Air Force Base is the center for the air defense of the entire country, and works in concert with the United States via NORAD for the air defense of Canada. U.S. portion of the North American continent. Activities are wide-ranging, from identifying and monitoring all aircraft entering Canada from overseas, to guarding VIPs flying in the country, to assisting aircraft suffering airborne emergencies, to aiding law enforcement versus smugglers, to participating in NORAD's Christmas Eve tracking of Santa Claus for children. For the mid-1970s to the mid-1990s, it took in unidentified flying object reports from across the country on behalf of the National Research Council of Canada, relaying the reports to a study at the Hertzberg Institute of Astrophysics, British Columbia. In 2000, it resumed UFO reporting, provided to researcher Chris Rutkowski at the University of Manitoba. In 2010, North Bay's Operations Center took the first steps towards transitioning from air to aerospace defense, commencing preparations for Sapphire, Canada's first military satellite. Sapphire functions as a contributing sensor in the United States Space Surveillance Network, performing surveillance of objects orbiting at 6,000 to 40,000 kilometers altitude, and delivering data on those objects to the Space Surveillance Operations Center in North Bay's Operations Center. The SSOC, in turn, coordinates with the Joint Space Operations Center in Vandenberg, California. On the 25th of February 2013, Sapphire was launched from a site in India and underwent technical testing and checks, expected to begin its duties in July 2013. Due to various technical delays, the satellite's FOC wasn't achieved until the 30th of January 2014. By end of that year, it had delivered 1.2 million observations of space objects. 22 Wing CFB North Bay has two unique properties among air bases in Canada. It is the only Canadian airbase that does not have flying units, and the only airbase in the country that does not have an airfield. Activities at North Bay 1920 to 1945. Pre-Second World War. North Bay's first contact with the Air Force took place on the 9th of October 1920, when a Government of Canada Felix F-3 flying boat overflew the town during the first crossing of Canada by aircraft. The F-3's pilots were Lieutenant Colonel Robert Leckie of Toronto and Major Basil Deacon Hobbs of Sault Ste. Marie. The Trans-Canada expedition was an epic venture, lasting 11 days and requiring 6 aircraft. The third leg was flown non-stop from the Canadian capital, Ottawa, to Sault Ste. Marie, Ontario, with North Bay as a checkpoint. Lecky's and Hobbs's encounter with North Bay was fleeting. They arrived without warning, approaching out of the east, catching residents unaware. Few had seen an aircraft before. The effect was electrifying, akin to the space shuttle appearing suddenly over the city today. Lecky steered for the downtown. Over the Canadian Pacific Railway station he dropped a signal to be telegraphed to the air board in Ottawa, making a good 50 miles per hour. Then, with a wave to lunchtime onlookers, the pilots swung their F-3 out over nearby Lake Nipissing, onwards to Sault Ste. Marie. The overflight planted interest in local politicians, businessmen and community leaders towards aviation, particularly the establishment of an air station at North Bay. In the summer of 1921, a Government of Canada Curtiss HS-2L flying boat taking on exploration and aerial survey work landed at North Bay, on Lake Nipissing. The HS-2L landed on Lake Nipissing and Trout Lake in 1922, for further aerial surveying as well as cargo and passenger transport. These flights amplified this interest on a campaign to the federal government for an aerodrome commenced. On the 1st of January 1923, the Department of National Defense took over responsibility and control over military and civil aviation in Canada. Over the next decade and a half, Canadian Air Force Squadron leader John Henry Tudhope, a South African-born First World War fighter pilot, almost single-handedly laid down the network of aviation in Canada, exploring and surveying the country for the construction of aerodromes and establishment of air routes for the Trans-Canada Airlines system, essentially a national air highway network. Considering that Canada was nearly the size of Europe and mostly raw, primal wilderness, Tudhope's undertaking was staggering. In 1930, S.L. Tudhope received the Mackay Trophy for his endeavors, the premier aviation award in Canada. In 1928, Tudhope stopped twice at North Bay, and again in 1931 and 1932. Based on his exploration and survey work in the Northern Ontario region. In June 1933, DND set up a headquarters in North Bay to supervise construction of emergency landing fields for the Ottawa to Port Arthur portion of the Trans-Canada Airway system. An 18-man unit operated out of the Dominion Rubber Company building, leased on Oak Street, downtown North Bay, which served as the headquarters, supply depot and living quarters. Unemployed men in each local district were hired as labor. Despite the primal ruggedness of Northern Ontario, by July 1936, 8 airfields had been hacked out of the wilderness, at Ray, Diver, Emsdale, South River, Rammore, Porquis Junction, Giles Depot and Tudhope, and the unit was disbanded. Most of these airfields have since been abandoned to the wild. Ironically, although the nucleus of the operation, and recommended by S.L. Tudhope in June 1936, North Bay was not considered as a site for an aerodrome. The first Air Force aircraft to land at North Bay arrived 17 to the 23rd of May 1930. 8 Royal Canadian Air Force flying boats stopped temporarily at Trout Lake during flights west. 2 were en route to Winnipeg, 2 to Lake Athabasca, Saskatchewan, 4 to northern Saskatchewan. This plus the landing field construction described above prompted local politicians, businessmen and community leaders to intensify the years-long campaign to the Canadian government for an airport. At issue was money. Who would finance the project? On the 21st of March 1938, the Perseverance paid off. The Canadian government approved expenditure of funds to build an airport at North Bay. The province of Ontario and city of North Bay would provide the land. It would be a Trans-Canada Airlines facility. TCA was the country's government-operated airline. On the 27th of April 1938, work began. The first unofficial landing by two area residents in a de Havilland DH-60 Moth took place on the 4th of July 1938, in the midst of construction. The first official landing occurred the 30th of September 1938, by Squadron Leader Robert Dodds, RCAF, to inspect the work. A Royal Flying Corps fighter pilot during the First World War, and close associate of Squadron Leader Tud Hope during the latter's exploration and survey of Canada. Dodds had been seconded by DND to the Department of Transport as Inspector of Airways and Aerodromes for the country. On the 28th of November 1938, the long-sought-after airport was ready to receive aircraft. Due to bad weather, regular passenger service at the facility did not begin until May 1939. Second World War. Despite a common, popular misconception that Royal Canadian Air Force Station North Bay was formed during the Second World War, the airbase didn't exist until 1951. In October 1939, the Canadian government announced that North Bay's fledgling airport, opened less than 12 months, was in contention as a British Empire air training plant site. The BEHEP was the biggest international military aircrew training operation in history. There were more aircrew training schools in Britain, but the BCATP taught and evaluated 131,553 pilot, navigator, observer, wireless operator, air gunner, and flight engineer recruits from around the world, plus 5,296 graduates from Royal Air Force schools. North Bay's location presented an allure for air training. It was far from major built-up areas and its skies uncluttered by air traffic. Altogether a reasonably safe arena for young aircrew hopefuls attempting to learn the tricky art of military flying. In 1940, a small glass greenhouse was constructed atop the airport's administration building in anticipation of air traffic control, necessary to handle the sudden proliferation of aircraft. But the government decided not to include North Bay in the training scheme. The airport's sole service to the Air Force over the next 2 years was essentially like a roadside truck stop, providing fuel, rest and meals to aircrew flying across the country. By 1942, so many aircraft were stopping at North Bay that No. 124 Squadron, RCAF, set up a 7-man detachment at the airport, under the command of a flying officer, 2 aero-engine mechanics, an electrician and an airframe mechanic refueled, serviced and repaired the aircraft. A driver and vehicle mechanics ordered the detachment's staff car, aircraft towing tractor and 1,000 imperial-gallon fuel truck. The staff car was eventually replaced by a more practical truck panel delivery. The biggest impact on the airport during the war was delivered by the Royal Air Force. In November 1940, a grand, dangerous experiment had been conducted. Masses of new, desperately needed aircraft shipped from Canada and Newfoundland for the war effort in Britain were being lost in the Atlantic Ocean. The cargo vessels sunk by German U-boats. To reduce these losses, an idea was proposed to ferry aircraft instead, fly them over the ocean. It was a breathtaking proposal. In 1940, transoceanic flying was raw and new. Aircrew had no navigation aids to steer by except the sun, moon and stars. Search and rescue beyond the coasts of North America, Ireland and Britain was non-existent. Mechanical and electrical breakdowns in aircraft were common. In an emergency, there was nowhere to land except the North Atlantic. Nevertheless, on the evening of the 10th of November 1940, the experiment began. 7 twin-engine Lockheed Hudson light bombers lifted off from Gander, Newfoundland en route for Britain. The odds were deemed so poor that only 4 of the bombers were expected to succeed. Yet the following morning, engines sucking the last gallons of fuel, all 7 bombers arrived safely in Northern Ireland. Inspired, the Royal Air Force commenced large-scale ferrying of aircraft. A training school for ferry aircrews was set up at Dorval, Quebec, outside Montreal. But by 1942 Dorval's airspace had become crowded with military aircraft. A new training site was set up at North Bay, taking advantage of the unclouded skies and freedom from major built-up areas that had made the airport an ideal BCATP candidate. On the 1st of June 1942, ground around the airport was cleared and tents set up for RAF Ferry Command's Transatlantic Training Unit. 5 Hudson bombers arrived shortly afterwards. Over the next 3 years, the unit, renamed No. 313 Ferry Training Unit in 1943, taught hundreds of aircrew, in 3 to 4 week courses, the techniques and procedures of transatlantic flying, and how to solve in-flight problems and emergencies. The size of the unit isn't known. However, although a formal airbase hadn't been established, the RAF expanded the airport dramatically. A new double hangar was built, as well as a works and stores building, guardhouse, salvage store, recreation building, hospital, fire station and fire protective system, coal compound and general-purpose building. The Canadian Department of Transport added water and power supply systems, plus provided clearing and grading for the hangars, aprons and roads. In 1943, 3 air traffic controllers were posted to the airport, the first ATC in North Bay, to coordinate airfield flying operations from the glass greenhouse built atop the admin building in 1940. 9 more Hudsons joined the original 5, along with 2 North American B-25 Michel bombers and a de Havilland Tiger Moth biplane. Avro Lancaster heavy bombers, de Havilland Mosquitoes and Douglas Dakota transports were taken on in 1944. The RAF personnel melded seamlessly into North Bay. They loved the fresh wildness of the region, an exotic experience for many of the British area citizens welcomed them as part of the community. The unit responded in kind, such as aiding blood donor drives, entering a team in the local softball league, and participated in shooting where they won and golf competitions, earning a consolation prize. In September 1945, with the war over, the RCAF detachment disbanded. Number 313 Ferry Training Unit followed suit in October. The facilities were donated to the Canadian government. Mass flying finished, the air traffic controllers were posted out and North Bay's airport returned to its sleepy, low-key pre-war state. And so it would remain until birth of the airbase in 1951. Despite the thousands of military flights transients through North Bay and training for transoceanic flying, there were only 11 crashes, with only 1 being fatal. On the 28th of April 1945, a No. 313 Ferry Training Unit B-25 Mitchell crashed, killing pilots Flying Officer Leslie William Lawrence Davis of England and Flight Sergeant William Gribben of Scotland. Both men are buried in North Bay cemeteries. This was also the first fatal crash of an aircraft, civilian or military, at North Bay's airport and in the North Bay area. RCAF Station North Bay. Royal Canadian Air Force Station North Bay was founded on 1 September 1951, part of the expansion of Canada's air defences in face of the rising threat of nuclear air attack from the Soviet Union. Canada, by virtue of its geography, was presented with an unpleasant situation. No sooner had the Second World War ended than friction between the Soviet Union and Western countries began, rapidly heated up. and spread around the globe, raising the specter of a Third World War, called the Cold War. Both sides had weapons pointed at each other. By 1949, nuclear weapons. The main adversaries were the Soviet Union and the United States. Canada lay between the two, meaning Soviet bombers would cross Canadian territory to strike at the United States, while U.S. fighters would swarm Canada to shoot them down. Whether the country liked it or not, in a war it would become a major nuclear battleground. For this reason, plus its long-standing friendship with the United States, Canada embarked on a nationwide development of its air defenses, dovetailed with America's expansion of its own defenses. North Bay's Air Force Base was a piece of this development. A massive building campaign began in 1951 around North Bay's tiny airport, including construction of an additional, larger double hangar, a proper control tower, air traffic control radio and radar systems, and fuel, oil, lubricant and weapons facilities for military aircraft, plus improvements to the runways, taxiways and aprons. In fact, North Bay was outfitted with a 10,000-foot runway, one of the longest in Canada, for reasons other than air defense. During war, the base was also a designated recovery site for American bombers returning damaged and/or short of fuel from nuclear strikes on the Soviet Union. A side effect of having this runway, decades later North Bay was selected as an emergency site for NASA's Space Shuttle, and periodically, due to the long runway and relatively isolated location, free of air traffic and built-up areas, plus security offered by the military, NASA used North Bay's airfield for research into different fields of aviation. Across Airport Road, the main route to the airfield from the city of North Bay, the rugged northern Ontario terrain was cleared and the support infrastructure for the station built: headquarters, barracks, dining hall, messes, hospital, gym, motor pool, supply, fire hall, RCAF police guardhouse, Protestant and Roman Catholic chapels, married quarters for Air Force families, and much more. The majority of facilities donated to the airfield by the British when the Royal Air Force departed at the end of the Second World War were demolished and replaced. The base had the biggest impact on the community since the linking of railways with North Bay in the early 20th century. Construction, services and contracts for the base infused millions of dollars into the community, and by the end of November 1953 the RCAF station was the leading employer in the area, 1,018 military personnel plus over 160 civilians. This status would continue for 4 decades, until the departure of the last flying squadron from North Bay in 1992 and subsequent downsizing of the airbase. At its peak, the airbase had a strength of about 2,200 military and civilian personnel. Number 3 All-Weather Operational Training Unit. The airbase's raison d'etre was air defense. On the 1st of November 1951, 2 months after RCAF Station North Bay's official birth, No. 3 All-Weather Operational Training Unit was formed at the base. No. 3 AWOTU was a state-of-the-art school teaching military flying, interception and fighter combat in all weather conditions, day and night, cutting-edge techniques. In 1951, students came from as far away as New Zealand. The instructors were among the world's elite in air defense. The unit's second officer commanding was Wing Commander Edward Crew, Royal Air Force. Crew was replaced in 1954 by another Englishman, Wing Commander Robert Braham. Crew and Braham also commanded RCAF Station North Bay for brief periods. Number 3 AWOTU transferred to RCAF Station Cold Lake in mid-1955. Among No.3 AWOTU's instructors were the first Americans to serve at North Bay's Air Base, USAF Major John Iser and Captain B. Delosier, arriving the 9th of January 1952. Americans have continued to serve at North Bay in one military capacity or another into the 21st century. Fighter squadrons. The sole purpose of the Air Force Base at North Bay is air defense, to monitor and protect the skies. At first this was limited to around North Bay, then expanded to the northern Ontario area of Canada, then East Central and Arctic Canada, and finally all of Canada, the latter an area the size of Europe. Between the base's birth in 1951 to 1964, as well as the Operational Training Unit, it was home to a succession of combat units devoted to this purpose. 5 fighter interceptor squadrons served at North Bay. In succession: 430 Squadron, 445 Squadron, 419 Squadron, 433 Squadron and 414 Squadron. 430 Squadron flew Canadair Sabre Mark II fighters, plus D-33 Silver Star jet trainers and propeller-driven North American Harvards for training. While at North Bay, the squadron was commanded by James "Stocky" Edwards, a highly decorated and an extraordinarily skilled fighter pilot with an impressive wartime career. North Bay's next fighter unit, 445 Squadron, was the first in the world armed with the Avro Cf 100 Canuck interceptor. The Cf 100 was one of 2 combat aircraft designed and built entirely in Canada, and the only one to enter Air Force service. It had the ability to hunt other aircraft in any weather, night to day, making the Cf 100 the preeminent interceptor among global air forces when it began service with the Royal Canadian Air Force in 1952. NOS 419, 433 and 414 squadrons also flew Cf 100 interceptors. Cf 100s also flew with the RCAF in Europe on NATO deployments. The other combat aircraft designed and built entirely in Canada was the Avro Cf 105 Arrow, a large, supersonic, heavily armed, state-of-the-art interceptor earmarked to replace the Cf 100. The project was cancelled, however, and the federal government ordered the destruction of all the Arrows. In its place, in 1961, the American McDonnell F-101 Voodoo replaced the CF-100 in Canada. North Bay's last fighter unit, 414 Squadron, was re-armed with the CF-101 Voodoo in 1962, flying the jet fighters in air defense until the squadron was disbanded in 1964. The Voodoo was faster and better armed than the CF-100, making it better suited than the CF-100 to catch and, if necessary, destroy the Soviet Air Force's newest strategic bombers, such as the Tupolev Tu-95 Bear. In addition to its fighter squadrons, from September 1956–September 1960, North Bay operated a CF-100 staging detachment at Lakehead Airport, Fort William, Ontario, at the western tip of Lake Superior. A pair of CF-100 interceptors from the base were deployed, or staged, at the Lakehead to defend the northwest Ontario and Manitoba regions of the country. In 1960 the staging detachment was changed from a fighter to a TACAN unit. RCAF Station North Bay also operated a second TACAN unit at Kapuskasing, in northern Ontario. TACAN is a radio navigation beacon that helps military aircrew determine the location and direction of flight. In the 1950s and 1960s it was an indispensable aid when traversing the vast Canadian wilderness landscape. Flight computers in aircraft then were Stone Age compared to today, and navigation assistance systems such as the Global Positioning System did not exist. To get lost over Canada presented airmen with the prospect of running out of fuel and having to eject or crash land in some of the wildest territory in North America. Wrecks and bodies were sometimes not found for weeks, months or years. Some have never been found. To give an idea of the roughness of the Canadian wilderness, even though authorities knew the general location, it took 4 years to find a rocket pod full of live rockets that had jettisoned from a jet fighter in 1958 when a switch malfunctioned. Both of North Bay's TACAN units were disbanded in the 1960s, but TACAN sites are still found throughout the country today, some providing assistance to civilian as well as military aviators. A concern for northern and bush operations in Canada was in identifying the magnetic North Pole, benchmark for all land, sea and air compasses in the northern hemisphere. The exact position of the magnetic North Pole was not pinpointed until flyers from 22 Wing in 1948 plotted the exact position. At that point, 22 Wing was a photographic flying unit stationed at CFB Rockcliffe, Ontario, mapping and charting the country. Separate from and unrelated to the airbase at North Bay, 131 Composite Unit and the temporary end of military flying at North Bay. 414 Squadron, North Bay's last fighter squadron, was disbanded in June 1964, partly due to government cuts to the RCAF, and partly due to a change in the strategy for the air defense of North America. The Soviet nuclear weapon-armed bombers should be stopped as far from the North American land mass as possible. Better to fight the war over the ocean rather than over home territory. North Bay was deemed too far from the coast for its fighters to be useful. In this strategy, 414 Squadron's departure left 131 Composite Unit as the sole flying unit at the base. Formed on 1 July 1962, 131 Composite Unit was a catch-all organization that flew 2 CT-33 Silver Star jet trainers and propeller engine Beech C-45 Expediter and Douglas C-47 CC-129 Dakota transports, as well as hauling cargo and personnel. The unit provided targets for training of RCAF interceptor aircraft, and were used by pilots and navigators on the Northern NORAD Region Headquarters staff at the base to maintain the flying skills. 131 Composite Unit was disbanded in November 1967. For the next 5 years, except for occasional visits by aircraft from other Air Force bases, all military flying at North Base East. One of the hangars, once packed with jet interceptors, was converted into an ice arena for the city of North Bay. The only air defense activity at the base in this 5-year period was in NORAD's famous underground complex.